Italy is a spectacular country, rich in history and culture, but its economy is struggling, and its place at the heart of the European Union is under threat. Between the current populist uprising and the country's fragile banking system, that threat suddenly looks very real. To try and get a better understanding of the situation, I've travelled to the home of my friend Steve Diggle, founder of Vulpes Investment Management, so he can help me understand the history and the investment implications behind the situation unfolding here.
This is such a beautiful part of the world you've found for yourself here. It's spectacular. But there's so much going on in this part of the world right now, and it feels as though it, again, has reached some kind of tipping point.
I think what's happening in Italy is probably not widely understood. It's a complicated story, and it comes directly out of a lot of history. And this is something you and I have talked about a lot. This is that the short-termism in markets means that people very often ignore these very long-term historical situations. I've always been fascinated by history, and a lot of what I have done in my career as both an investor and a trader is look at these long-term patterns, much deeper, longer-term context than what's happening in the next 30 seconds. Where's the euro going to be tomorrow? Where's the S&P going to be in 3 weeks' time? I mean, that's important from a trading perspective, but unless you really understand where something has come from, which means you really have to look at its long-term history, you really can't understand what's going on. And I think very often you can use history to teach you an awful lot of things about the current situation, particularly where people have made horrible mistakes. And I think one of the mistakes people are making now is they just assume Italy, it's a bit of a basket case, none of this really matters, they'll roll over, as they always do, and everything will roll on. It might be different this time. So I'd like to take you to a few of my favourite places. You've never been to Florence, which I find amazing. We have to go to Florence, which is where it all began, centre of Italian banking in the 16th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, and also one of the most beautiful cities on earth. We'll go to Siena, their ancient rival, also very somewhat contemporary.
There I have been before.
And then we'll come back and I'll show you Cortona, which is just over the hills here. It's a complicated place. You just wonder, why doesn't it work better? Why isn't it wildly successful? Some of the most talented people in the world, some of the best brands in the world. Why is it such a perpetual mess? And I've got my own theories, and we'll talk a bit about that when we're on the road.
All right, well, let's go see some of it, shall we?
Okay.
All right.
The first leg of our journey will take us to the spectacular city of Florence, where modern-day banking began some 7 centuries ago. But on the way, I wanted to find out how Steve's love affair with this wonderful country began.
I've been coming to Italy since I was a teenager, and I've loved this part of the world ever since. I was a real fan of Renaissance history, which I studied for both O and A level. So when I was 16, 17, I came out here to look at the stuff on a Euro-rail. Remember those Euro-rail passes? Yeah. You go everywhere in Europe for like, what was it, 40 quid or something? And I literally was breathless when I saw the Duomo for the first time. It was just the most amazing thing when you've walked 3 days through this countryside. Anyway, so I just loved it. People were so nice to you when you're just walking along. You know, someone gave me some tomatoes out of her garden.
They gave them or threw them at you?
She just gave them to me. It was very nice of her. And people offer me drinks. It was this incredible warmth of the people, excellent food, beautiful countryside, and even more beautiful cities with all of this extraordinary profundity of ancient art, architecture.
Well, that's always what strikes me on my rare trips back to Europe. You forget living in Asia, where everything is either 1,000 years old or it was built yesterday. There's nothing in that. And I went to see my dad in Paris a few years ago. The first time I've been to Paris in forever. And I was just staring at the architecture because I hadn't seen anything like it. You don't see it in the US.
Well, I think France and Italy are totally blessed in that they have this beautiful, gentle, bucolic countryside. Look at that.
Yeah.
And also this incredible beauty by man. So here we are in Florence, and there's Brunelleschi's masterpiece, Il Duomo,
Giotto Tower to the left, the River Arno, and there's the Ponte Vecchio. The Ponte Vecchio being where all the gold sellers are, so you'll like that.
Yes.
So the Ponte Vecchio is the reason why the gold sellers are there is because if you had your business on the bridge, you didn't have to pay your full municipal taxes because you weren't actually inside the city walls. So the reason why London Bridge and these ancient medieval bridges used to be full of merchants is because they were actually avoiding paying tax.
But this is such a cradle of finance, this city. I mean, there's so many things happen here that have shaped everything that we know today.
Yeah, it was the financial centre of the Italian states for centuries, and now synonymous with the Medici. But before the Medici, the richest family in Europe were the Bardis, and they were based here. And they were the people who initially set up an Italian banking network that went across all of Europe. They were the first people to really internationalize banking. And it's interesting that in Italy, unlike, say, most of the rest of Europe, where the idea of lending for interest and profit was banned by the church.
Yeah.
So principally an area that only minorities, especially the Jewish, were involved in. But in Italy, it was a respectable profession, wealthy families, international organizations. So the Bardi established this international, this pan-European network, which was their downfall because they lent an awful lot of money to Edward III, King of England, who spent it on building a huge army and then decided not to pay it back. So that bankrupted the Bardi, and that was the end of them. And into that vacuum came the Medici, who increasingly became the most powerful people in this town with their new innovation. Double entry bookkeeping.
Exactly.
Double entry bookkeeping. That was the financial revolution of the 15th century that allowed them to continue to control this vast empire.
But what was it about this part of Italy that made it become such a powerful banking centre?
Well, it's a bunch of things. I mean, geographically, the Arno was an important river. We're right in the middle of Italy here, so everything coming south kind of has to go through here. Everything coming, heading from the north heads here. The city itself was a republic, so it was part of this melange of independent states, but without any controlling aristocracy. You had an environment in Florence that just allowed independent wealth to grow up, because you didn't have like one controlling family until increasingly the Medici rose to be predominant in this town. But interestingly, they were probably the first people who established political control through wealth rather than through military force. So this is a town of merchants. It was a place of business, principally, and had laws that were appropriate to that, and then didn't give anyone any advantage, as in it was considered to be a fair place to do business. So, yeah, I mean, but geographically, this is the ideal place to have a business. It's on major trading routes on a river, a place where you had a sound currency. So the florin is the currency of Florence, gold-backed, which of course you would love, and a currency that became recognised all throughout Europe as a dependable currency.
But Italy back then was a group of independent states. It was more of a federation, I guess, than anything else.
Not even a federation. Not even.
But it had that. It wasn't a country. That was the one thing it wasn't. Was a country.
Well, and it wasn't a country until 1870. In fact, Florence was the first capital of the United Italy until it moved to Rome, because they were still fighting down the south. But so the first parliament, the first government of United Italy. But that was only in 1870. So one of the things that continues to plague Italy, and you can still see it in Italian politics today, is this tremendous sense of regional identity over national identity. Yeah. It's incredibly strong. So if you're born and you're brought up here, you're a Florentine. You're not an Italian.
Right.
You are an Italian, but you're a Florentine first, you're a Tuscan second, and you're an Italian third. And if you're from Florence, you really don't like those people from Pisa up the road.
Sure.
This is not just like a friendly rivalry sort of thing. You really don't like those people. And the people from Pisa don't like the people from Livorno, and the people from Siena don't like the people from Florence. So these regional identities are incredibly strong. in Italy. And they always have been. So the national identity is a weak thing. So right now, in this coalition government, the League, right up until just before the election, was calling itself the Northern League.
Yeah.
So it's a regional identity talking about how the North continuously subsidises the South, which is true. The South is much poorer, and that if the North was separate and wasn't constantly subsidising the South, they'd all be better off, and they need more autonomy, not just from Brussels, which they're very keen, but actually they want autonomy from the rest of Italy.
Yeah.
That was initially their agenda. I mean, it's a regional, the idea of a regional political party, the idea in a place like France or Britain that you'd have a regional identity, a sort of Freedom for Cornwall group, being part of the government, or Freedom for Brittany is odd. But in Italy, it makes perfect sense because these regional identities continue to be incredibly strong. So Italians it's a language, it's a culture. They all come together to support football, but in very few other senses are Italians really a nation, and they haven't been for very long. So it's a very strong unitary identification, but it's not a strong political organisation. And one of the reasons why we've never really had strong political forces in Italy is part of this constant fracturing with these regional identities. So, Florence is a great example. I mean, Florence was an independent republic all the way until the 18th century.
The problems we've had in the world in the last 10 years, they manifested in '08, and that, I guess, woke a lot of people up because suddenly there was a focal point for all that anger and all that resentment. You had a place to focus it, which was initially on the situation, and then it became on the bankers, and then it became on the politicians, and then the EU, and it just builds and builds and builds, with no real end outlet. There's always something else to blame or someone else to blame.
Well, we've reached a point now where you have these two very eccentric populist parties, the Five Star Movement and the League, as we must call them, who don't really agree on much, but they agree on that they all hate Brussels. And in that, they have found, a straw man which unites Italians, because there is a great deal of anger and resentment against Brussels. And that's a unifying thing. So right now, you get a sense that the government, at least, and backed by a significant amount of the Italian population, want this confrontation. They actually want a showdown with Brussels. And it looks like that's what they're trying to provoke with this budget. So it's an expression of the will of the people. Italy has a perpetual fiscal problem. It's one of the reasons why Italy had to sort of crawl in 1999. It was very much uncertain whether Italy would qualify for the European Union.
Right.
People forget this now, but I remember at the time, I was working in London, it wasn't certain, because Italy's fiscal situation was so weak. The Germans, to a lesser extent the French, were insisting on a relatively high standard of fiscal orderliness in order to qualify for the European Union and the Euro, and Italy was going to be outside, and the politicians pretty much promised anything just to get into that club. And the consequences of those promises made in 1999 was that Italy came in at a very weak level with a very weak hand. It came in with the lira pegged at the wrong level, which basically has meant since 2000, Italy has been walking uphill at a strategic disadvantage to most of the rest of Europe, especially Germany. And it's one of the reasons why we're here today. The economy has not really strengthened. It's still smaller than it was in 2008.
Yeah, which is remarkable.
German economy is much bigger, right? German economy is 15% bigger than it was in 2008 now. This is still smaller. People feel it. Unemployment's still at 9.7%. Youth unemployment's still at 30%.
Yeah.
30%. It's ridiculous. For a country with this level of creativity, with this level of sophistication, with this level of
and industry. I mean, this is
to have the fact that over 30% of young people have no job, and that's not new. That's been at this level for a long time. It's not surprising that you have a very wide and a very strongly felt system of grievance. My point is, yes, Brussels deserves a fair amount of that, but until you unravel this crippling level of bureaucracy in Italy, people like myself, and I think Italians, just are not going to be able to, or not going to bother to start businesses. I mean, these young people, they can't start a business. It's just impossible for them,
Yeah.
even if they've got some backing, because by the time they've filled in like 12 different forms and applied to 6 different departments, to open a sandwich shop, they just give up. So Brussels is highly responsible for some of Italy's troubles, no doubt about it. And the politicians deserve some blame for making promises that were going to be very hard for Italy to fulfill. There's a very wide sense of that the European project has not delivered to Italy. It's been a burden. It's favoured other people, and it's time for the Italians to put Italy first again. Or in the case of the League, to put Northern Italy first again.
Yeah, right.
And I guess, for Florence's point, to put Florence first again. How that will play out, I don't know. I mean, this is a new experiment in Italian politics, right? We have a coalition of some very young people. The leaders of these parties are in their 30s.
Yeah.
The parties basically barely exist as we would recognise political parties. What happens? We'll see. It's an experiment.
This is absolutely astonishing.
Have you ever been here before?
No, I've not been
I've never
before.
seen it before. Oh man, I didn't realise. Oh, fantastic!
No, I've not been here before.
No, so there you go.
It's astounding.
I mean, Italy is full of beautiful buildings. I mean, St. Peter's in Rome is really impressive.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But this, for me, is on. It's just a different sort of. It's just a different sort of amazing.
I mean, really, I can see why you said it's breathtaking. I mean, it really is.
It's
Just remarkable. Just remarkable.
And you know that no one had ever built a dome like this ever before.
Right.
They knew the Romans could do it. Do you know the story?
No, go on.
It's a great story. They knew the Romans could do it because the Parthenon and so on existed, but no one knew how. No one knew how they'd done it, and every time they tried to do it, it would fall in. So Brunelleschi basically, from first principles, worked out how you do it. So what you do is see those arms.
Yeah.
So each of those arms basically is separate, right? And what you do is, like fingers, you get this huge counterweight here, right?
Okay.
The thing that hangs down inside, right? Enormous counterweight, and it
Pulls them all together.
Pulls them together,
Yeah.
right? And it holds them perfectly. The thing's holding everything up is actually gravity.
Right.
Anyway, then many years later, they actually found out how the Romans actually did it. They didn't do that at all. They just would fill the thing with earth, build it on top,
around it.
gradually, because they had so many slaves. They're like,
Right.
just send in 1,000 slaves.
Yeah.
So Brunelleschi thought this was how the Romans did it, but in fact it wasn't how the Romans did it at all.
Way too clever for his own good.
Way too clever.
Way too clever.
So no one, as I say, worked it out from first principles.
That's the way to do it.
Oh, so that's the Medici symbol, right? So
there's the 6 balls.
So
There you
even on the churches, right? It's everywhere. You've got to make sure you know whose town you're in. Of course, the Medici, they kind of want to seize power. The interesting thing was, when they were actually really politically at their apogee, they weren't involved in banking at all anymore. They got out got out of the banking business.
But they got into the Pope business, didn't they?
Yeah, they got into the
It's a
Pope
better
business.
business to be in.
Yeah, the Pope business and the running the town, owning the town business. Politics was definitely a more steady profession than banking.
No, true, but I
Particularly when you were actually obliged to lend money to kings who were not terribly keen on paying you back.
Yes.
So
no, listen. If you can make the Pope business your family business, that's a pretty good one.
It's a rotating thing. It was actually, of course, it's very expensive to become the Pope. There was a lawful lot of bribery involved in that. Of course. But once you were the Pope, then yes.
You just
It was
had
like
to
buying
avoid. You just had to avoid being murdered by the people that work for you.
Yeah.
obviously, which
Had to buy the
equally
franchise.
is- by the franchise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like a burger chain. 5 popes.
Everywhere you look in Florence, you see history staring silently, stoically back at you. But Italy is a land of passion, and nowhere is that passion more obvious than in Italian politics, and that's creating a potentially dangerous dynamic for the whole of Europe.
That stuff's going to kill you.
I know it is. So this Italian politics situation it fascinates me because as an Englishman, obviously, I understand the desire to get out of Europe. I get that. But I'm really interested. But from what we spoke about earlier, both sides are locked in this problem together, and they're both a big problem for the other side. One wants out, one wants to keep them in. If they keep them in, it creates problems for Europe. If they get out, it creates problems for Europe. How are the different dynamics playing out from an Italian perspective?
I think one of the huge differences between the British experience, or maybe we should just say the English experience, and the Italian is Italy's a founding member, core member.
Right.
I mean, it's France, Germany, Italy, right? So Britain's it always has been, both geographically and psychically, on the outskirts of Europe, right? Italy's not. Italy's an absolutely core part of Europe, and it's a core part of the European project. So the fact that the Italians now are feeling that they don't want to be part of that is a vastly more impactful thing than the fact that the Britain, who were always very marginal in terms of how they would be involved in Europe, I think it's much more important. The EU without Britain is imaginable. The EU without Italy is almost unimaginable, and not just because it's a big country, and a big part of the European economy, but also it's integral to some of those ideas. So the fact that you've reached this situation, I think, is indicative of a few things. One is just the total indifference of Brussels to these growing sentiments. The extraordinary thing about Brussels is just their total level of conviction.
Yeah.
There is no doubt the British vote to leave. It's Britain's problem. Italy are saying, well, we're really very unhappy with this burden that's being placed on us. We want less austerity. We want to run this big budget deficit. No, we're going to reject your budget. Once again, it's like there's no flexibility. It's authoritarian.
Yeah.
So you have a groundswell of opinion. Yes, it's a very odd government, this. It's nothing like we've ever seen before. But they are agreed on one thing, which is they're going to fight Brussels, and they're going to fight Brussels on this budget. How we've come to this situation is a direct consequence of the euro, right? Because the situation for Italy is caused by this idiosyncrasy in a currency union, which turns normal economics upside down, right? Normally, economic conditions are strong, interest rates go up. Economic conditions are weak, interest rates go down. That doesn't happen in a currency union, of course. Currency union, you're locked into this weird system, which is that when the economies are weak, you get punished with higher rates, and when your economy is strong, you get rewarded with lower rates. So Germany has virtually full employment. Unemployment's down to 3.7%, interest rates are still at zero. They're borrowing 10-year money at 80, 60 basis points. Italy, economy's weak, unemployment's at 9.7%. Interest rates, particularly with this budget standoff, going up towards 4%. Massive spread. So Italy's being punished by this European mechanism, which is it's getting higher rates because it wants to fight, it wants less austerity. But the monetary situation's tightening.
Right.
They want to run a fiscally more generous budget, but the monetary system's tightening. So it locks Italy into this system.
But this is so straightforwardly obvious.
Yeah, but how? Just like Greece, how do you escape? There's no escape.
Right.
We don't really understand what happens in customs unions long term because we've never had a project like the euro long term. It's just never been done before. Practically, one of the beautiful things about free market economics is it's self-correcting, right? The problem for high prices is, the cure for high prices is high prices. The cure for low prices is low prices. So capitalism has this self-correcting mechanism. Currency unions seem to have a self-destructive mechanism, right? Which is that you either spiral into having an ever stronger economy with ever lower interest rates, which rewards you with a stronger economy, possibly even overheating, though we still haven't seen that in Germany, but lower rates when you don't need it. Yeah. And when you need lower rates, you get higher rates. It's not a self-correcting system. It may be a fatal flaw in the euro. Yeah. Now, why don't people want to talk about it? It's because the euro is part of a European project. It's a belief system. It's not a financial system. It hasn't been thought out as a financial system. It's about a belief in a federal Europe. And it's about of a group of people, largely the better educated, university elite of a country that have decided this is the way we're going to avoid European wars, we're going to have this ever more perfect union. So the idea of the euro isn't questioned because it's like questioning the European project. If you do that, you're somehow a bad European, possibly a bad person. How do you correct this system? It's not obvious. How do you get lower? Italy and Greece need lower interest rates. How do you get them? With the currency union, it's not obvious.
But this is the fundamental problem with this, and I think we can sit here, two guys on a street corner in Florence, and see what the problems are. They're obvious, and they haven't changed. It's not like this has suddenly become a problem. This has been a problem day one. Margaret Thatcher's last speech to Parliament laid out exactly what was going to happen, and it's happened almost exactly as she predicted, with the problems with no fiscal union but a currency union. And yet, to your point, the EU burghers are clinging on to this thing and refuse not just to contemplate, okay, where might this be weak and how can we shore it up, but no, it is what it is, and you will be bound by it. Which is why when you look at what happened with Brexit and you look at what's happening here in Italy, you have a country here which is just kind of in stasis. It's muddling along, and it's everything about this country is fantastic, apart from the fact that it's a disaster, right?
I think that's in a way that's life in Italy.
You studied politics. You someone who's spent a lot of time in politics and possibly could have had a career in politics had you not chosen to go down the route of finance. Yes, when you look at this through everything you've learned and you understand about politics, are the Italians playing this the right way? Is there another way for them to play it?
There's no negotiation going on here. These are your rules.
Right.
So what are the Italians supposed to do? Well, clearly, what the Italians have tried to do for 10 years has failed, which is why all of the regular political parties have dissolved, right? The political parties that were the mainstay of Italian politics from, the 50s to the turn of the century, they've gone. They're not represented in this current government at all. So clearly, the way they tried to play it has been comprehensively rejected by the people. Now we've got these populists in who really don't have a joined-up manifesto system of government. They've just got a very fundamental, incoherent sense of grievance. All right, it's a start. I don't know how it plays out. It doesn't feel like it's going to have a great outcome because you don't have a negotiation going on. You have increasingly obdurate fixed positions.
Yeah.
And I think when one of the leaders, I think it was from the League, said, well, if Brussels rejects the budget, we're going to throw an even more stimulative budget.
Right.
That didn't feel like a negotiation that's going the right way.
No, but they've built their power base very quickly, which to them obviously says what we're saying is resonating very, very strongly with the people, which it also is reinforced that the more we stand up to Brussels, the more support we're going to get.
That's clearly happened.
But we saw that in Greece with Syriza when they came to power.
But they stayed in, didn't they?
But they stayed in, and they backed down once they got power. I don't know. To me, it feels like the League and the Five Star are different. People are positioning themselves as if it's Greece all over again, and they'll make a lot of noise, and then they'll bow down like good dogs. But this is Italy. This isn't Greece.
It doesn't appear that there is any debate going on in Brussels about how to accommodate these views. It's all about enforcement of rules, punishment. So that's an empire, right? That's
exactly right.
That's an empire.
Exactly
that
right.
Inflexibility of empire, right? It's the oak, not the willow, right? It doesn't bend. It stands until it breaks. And maybe Italy will be the thing that breaks the euro. Maybe it breaks the European Union. I don't know. It's unlikely, but I don't think it's beyond the bounds of possibility.
Essentially, you say it's unlikely, and we've had, 4 years ago we had a similar period of stress where everyone said, "Oh, that's when Quitterly and Italy came up." At the foundations of that was the Italian banking system.
Yes.
Which we're sitting here outside the Medici Palace, and we're going to go to Siena, and we're going to go and look at the banking system a little more closely. Nothing's changed in that system. We're 4 years further on. The banks are under more stress.
Yeah.
And I think everybody is assuming this is 2014 all over again, and it won't matter.
It might be.
But I just get this sense that because of what's happening in between, where Italy was almost like a rogue state, Britain wasn't even in the party at that point, but now we're seeing Poland complaining, we're seeing Austria, we're seeing Hungary, we're seeing disaffection everywhere. And it just feels to me like Italy might this time say, you know what, to hell with it. We'll take our chances. Can they do that, or is that completely unrealistic?
Well, I think they could, and practically, leaving the euro is a hell of a lot easier than leaving the European Union.
Right, yes. Well, if they'll let you leave, one and not the other.
I think the surprising thing is, given how many obviously clever people are involved in the running of the European Union, how incredibly dumb the way they're approaching this situation is. And it mystifies me. I would bet if you were to sit down in Brussels and have a conversation with these people, they would completely disagree. They would say, yes, we've got some problems, but everything's going swimmingly. On we go, right? There's a project to have a unified military budget and unified this, and it's a belief system. It's a belief system, and the belief system is we're going to have a federal Europe, and that's going to be the greatest achievement of our lives. We're not going to let these short-term setbacks, mere economics, affect our project. Italy's divided, just as Britain is deeply divided over Brexit. Italy's deeply divided over it. I mean, there's still lots of people in Italy who are very committed to the European Union. I mean, the Five-Star Movement, and the League don't represent, all of the Italians. So just in the same way that Britain is divided, and those divisions could be used and are being used against it. Very often you feel like Britain's negotiated against itself on Brexit. Italy's divided on this issue as well. Because it goes way beyond economics. It really goes beyond this, what am I as a person? We've got these two flags flying here, European Union next to the Italian flag. A lot of younger Italians would like to think of themselves as Europeans. Not even as Italians or Florentines or
which is, I mean, that's a significant shift from generations, that you would think yourself as even bigger than your country first, as opposed to from your town first and up, to say I'm European, then Italian, and then, I mean, if that mindset takes hold, maybe there is a chance, but it feels like that's another generation away before that's strong enough, I don't know.
There are 500,000 Italians working in Germany.
Right.
It's great they can go to Germany, but the fact they have to in order to find a decent job, that should worry everyone. What's wrong with being here? Well, we know what's wrong with being here, but what do those people feel? Well, they're probably very happy with a job in Germany, but I know which country I'd rather live in.
Yeah.
So where do they go? It's highly problematic, because you're really only being offered two alternatives right now, which is conflict, which is the way that this coalition seems to want to go. Conflict and a unilateral declaration of, we're going to have our own fiscal policy, which is going to be unanswerable to Brussels. But we're still tied into this monetary union. That doesn't sound great. Brussels, you're going to have your austere budgets. You're not going to deviate in any way. And we'll maybe continue to bail out your banking system if you're, well behaved. I'm glad to say I don't have significant dog in this hunt, because I think it's very hard to see how it plays out. We've looked at the Italian banks from time to time, because the stocks are down a long, long way. I mean, a long way.
For sure.
You've got to assume that Italy will have a banking system. It will carry on. It's been here for 500 years. They kind of invented it in this town, just over there. But at what point do you buy the stocks? I think it's really hard to work out. So my instinct, although I love this place and I love to live here, is you want to stay out of it. Because I think anyone who wants to say this is definitively what's going to happen is just rolling the dice.
I completely agree. And that's why, these conversations are interesting, but there's no outcome to a conversation. So you have to try and kick around the possibilities. But what you said there struck me when you talked about the conflict. One of the choices is conflict. And as we've seen throughout this part of our little trip, this is a country mired in conflict. This is a country that's done conflict forever, and conflict is part of its DNA. And so, we've had this a couple of generations, 4 generations maybe, of one united Italy, but at the root of it all, as we've talked about, is still this underlying conflict between each other.
Regional, and in some cases, very local town, identities.
Yeah. So it strikes me that the success of La Liga and of Five Star is in maybe galvanising that appetite for conflict and giving the people of Pisa, instead of a fight with Siena, well, you know, there's a bigger guy over here that we can unite as Italians and have our conflict, and it's at those guys in Brussels. I just get this strong sense that they've got a reasonably good chance of success of stirring that up to the point where they go and punch Europe in the face.
I think it's perfectly possible. There's enough discontent in Italy now, and there's at many different levels and from many different people, and for many different reasons. Some of them much better thought out than others. I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about that we really should talk about is just this very deep and perfectly legitimate Italian anger at the immigration situation.
That is something we need to get into in a lot greater detail, but I'm going to save that for later in the day because we've got places to go, you and I.
All right. Who's going to pay for the coffee?
Well, I guess that's going to be me then, isn't it?
On the next leg of our journey, Steve and I travel to Siena, home of the oldest continuously operating bank in the world, Banca Monte dei Paschi, to look at where the country's fragile banking industry fits into the European mosaic.
Look at this. The scale of the ambition is amazing. One of the other Achilles heels that Italy has is not just its sovereign debt, it's this banking crisis. These guys represent a monumental failure to support business. If you really want a lesson on why a stock that is fallen a lot is not cheap, this is the one.